Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Lucky Akirit Unrali, the headlines. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov set to chair UN Security Council meeting as tensions rise with the United States. Japan activates missile interceptors as it prepares to shoot down any fragments from a North Korean satellite that may fall on its territory. Spanish Minister of Defense Margarita Robles says 6 Leopard 2 tanks are on their way to Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is set to chair the UN Security Council meeting today as tensions rise with the United States. According to Russian officials, Mr. Lavrov and his United States counterpart, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, don't plan to meet on the sidelines of the UN Security Council meeting. Tensions continue to rise between Russia and the United States over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and deepening diplomatic rows. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said, quote, "We do not have an agenda with the Americans for discussion at the ministerial level at the moment." And in Ukraine itself, its 93rd Mechanized Brigade has released video from Bakhmut showing Ukrainian forces operating inside the city after Russia said it took 3 more districts there. Russia's defense ministry, on the other hand, said that Russian assault troops had captured 3 more districts in the western part of Bakhmut. Pavlo Krylenko, the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration, says 2 people were killed and 2 others wounded in the eastern Ukrainian city over the weekend. Ukrainian and Russian units have been battling for months over the eastern city, much of which now lies in ruins. Meanwhile, local officials say at least 5 Russian missiles hit the eastern Ukrainian city of Khakiv, as well as its surrounding districts, causing some damage to civilian buildings. The regional governor, Ole Sinehubov, said 1 missile hit a house in the village of Kotleri, just to the south of Kharkiv, while another sparked a major fire in the city itself. 2 houses were badly damaged by the strike in Kotleri, one being devastated by the explosion, which hit the other nearby home. Elsewhere, Japan has activated missile interceptors and is prepared to shoot down any fragments from a North Korean satellite that may fall on Japanese territory. According to a ministry statement, Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada has instructed troops to ready PAC-3 surface-to-air missiles in southwestern Japan, including Okinawa and nearby islands, in an area believed to be under a flight path of a North Korean rocket that will carry the satellite. He also ordered the deployment of destroyers equipped with SM-3 ship-to-air missiles to coastal waters. Mr. Hamada instructed troops to implement measures necessary to limit damage in the event of a ballistic missile falling. An order to fire missiles has also been approved by the Prime Minister. And Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has cast doubts on Ukraine's long-held aspirations to join NATO. His intervention came after the bloc's boss, Jens Stoltenberg, had said that all NATO allies have agreed that Ukraine will become a NATO member. Mr. Stoltenberg has consistently said Kiev will join NATO in the medium term once the Russian invasion is over. But Mr. Orbán was quick to express his surprise at the latest claim in a one-word tweet on Friday. What, said the Hungarian Prime Minister, reacting to an article on Mr. Stoltenberg's comments. NATO is a military alliance of now 31 countries, mainly in Europe, but also including the United States and Canada. Hungary, like all members, can veto new members joining. NATO members, including Hungary, agreed in 2008 that Ukraine would eventually join the alliance while denying it immediate membership. Joining the bloc brings the protection of NATO's Article 5, which says an attack on one member is an attack on all. And Ukraine has condemned what it called absurd comments from China's ambassador to France, who questioned the sovereignty of former Soviet countries. France and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have also expressed dismay over the remarks. In a televised interview, the Chinese ambassador Liu Shiye was asked about his position on whether Crimea is part of Ukraine. And his words, he said, historically, The peninsula was part of Russia and had been offered to Ukraine by former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. These ex-USSR countries don't have actual status in international law because there's no international agreement to materialize their sovereign status. His comments refer not just to Ukraine, which Russia invaded in February last year, but also to all former Soviet republics, which emerged as independent nations after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, including many members of the European Union. Meanwhile, Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong has lodged a complaint with the South Korean ambassador to Beijing over erroneous remarks by the South Korean president about Taiwan. According to a statement by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Sun said South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol's remarks were totally unacceptable. He also expressed strong dissatisfaction about the remarks. The diplomatic dispute between Beijing and Seoul stems from a recent interview in which President Yoon said increased tension around Taiwan was due to attempts to change the status quo by force and that he opposed attempts to do so. The South Korean leader also said the dispute between China and Taiwan was now a global issue. And Spanish Minister of Defense Margarita Robles says 6 Leopard 2 tanks bound for Ukraine have left the Spanish port city of Santander in northern Spain and are en route to their destination. Ms. Robles told journalists the tanks left Santander along with 20 heavy transport vehicles, and the trip by sea would take from 5 to 6 days. Robles said last week that 4 more Leopard tanks, in addition to the current 6, will be sent to Ukraine following repairs as soon as possible. Ukraine has been reliant on outdated Soviet-era tanks throughout the Russian invasion and has appealed to the West for modern battle tanks to bolster Kiev's forces. And the U.S. decision to provide Ukraine with 31 advanced M1A2 Abrams tanks will make a difference in the war, but is no silver bullet. That's according to U.S. Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Milley's remarks come as the United States announced that the Abrams tanks to be used to train the Ukrainians will arrive in Germany in the coming weeks. At the same news conference, closing a meeting of the Ukraine General Contact Group at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the U.S. Defense Secretary Lord Austin also commented on the situation in Sudan. General Austin said the U.S. military is preparing as many options as possible ahead of a possible evacuation from the U.S. Embassy, but no decisions had been made.
The Ukrainian military continues to perform very well. Intense fighting in and around Bakhmut continues and has for several months. Russia is expending significant manpower for very little gain. Russia is intensifying indiscriminate shelling in Avdiivka and other cities and urban areas. And Russia continues to pay severely for its war of choice. Unlike Ukrainian forces, who are highly motivated to fight for their country, to fight for their freedom, their democracy, and their way of life, the Russians lack in leadership, they lack will, the morale is poor, and the discipline is eroding.
General Mark Milley, U.S. Chief of Staff there. And EU foreign ministers will meet in Luxembourg today to discuss the war in Ukraine and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's appeal for more weapons and ammunition to fight Russia. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dimitri Peskovs, is expected to address ministers by video conference. Russia says its special military operation in Ukraine was necessary to protect its security against what it sees as a hostile and aggressive West. Ukraine and its Western allies say Russia is waging an unprovoked war aimed at grabbing territory. Let's talk now to Yinka Oyeniji, international affairs analyst, who is joining us from the East Midlands in the United Kingdom this morning. Good morning to you, Yinka. Thanks for being with us, as always.
Good morning, Mr. Lade. It's good to see you after a while.
Indeed. Let's dive right into this. The tanks, the Leopard tanks that have been promised Ukraine have been quite some time in coming, and they're not coming, in the torrents that one would have expected. They're coming in 2s and 4s and 6 and all of that. And then, from the information we have, it does appear as if these aren't new tanks. The ones that are coming aren't new, because we keep hearing about repairs and refurbishment How much of a difference do you think they will make, especially given the fact that the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman is now saying, look, they will be useful, but they are no silver bullet?
Well, I can tell you immediately that just listening to the news reports you gave a few minutes ago, we have a full-scale war on our hands. I think it's gone beyond just trying to manage its situation and hoping that some miracle would happen to make it go away. We have a full-scale war. And what I mean by full-scale war is that China has now come out openly to take a stand, okay? Taiwan also is part of the calculations going on at the moment. So the next phase of this conflict with the French President Macron being involved is to try to douse tension. And that is why Ukraine will not be getting as many arms and ammunition as it was handed down in the last few months. The next phase is not about infantry warfare. Nobody's going to go out there to fight the next phase of this war on land. You can take that. Even Russia has since, in a way, barricaded itself against any Ukraine invasion of its own by digging trenches that cut across their boundaries. The next phase of the war will be fought in the air, and that is full-scale war. So pay attention to drones, pay attention to drone technology, drones fitted with missiles for aerial attacks. In the last couple of weeks, Russian warplanes have been escorted off the airspace across the Black Sea. That is where the next phase of the war will go, and that is full-scale war. But international leaders are making a last-bridge effort, including Brazil and China and even the United States, and then now Spain, to ensure that the war does not escalate beyond where we are at this moment. So the next phase will be to either consider totally extinguishing the war, leave it at the state at which it is, or go full air ballistics. But at the moment, it's no longer going to be fought on the land. So that is why nobody would send modern technology or modern tanks on land to Ukraine. They would never be used. They would not be useful because the world cannot simply afford a war on land at this time. So it is either we just put a stop to it at the moment or say we can't escalate it beyond where it is, but definitely not on land anymore.
How much of a chance do you think they have of success in that regard? I mean, I understand when you say that, there are many people or many of these key countries who do not want it to escalate into a full-scale land war, of course, because that is a sure recipe for casualties. And in their various countries, the population is not prepared for large-scale casualties, particularly in places like the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in Spain, and most of these other countries. Now, how much of a chance do you think they have of success in that regard, considering all the other factors that have been brought to play in the war, the Chinese support for Russia and the issue of drones that you mentioned brings to mind North Korea and Iran and so on. How much of a chance of success do you think they have with all these other, shall we say, unknown quantities, also in the mix?
Data shows that Russia has lost this war on land. Data shows that clearly. The ammunitions, the tanks, and the manpower. Russia simply does not have the manpower to push further. There has not been any recent incursion into new territories in Ukraine. It's been at Bakhmut, and that's where it has been for the past at least 8 weeks. Okay, and at that point, we can't declare that anybody has won this war right there. There have been ambushes here and there. There have been lone attacks on civilian installations in Ukraine, but Russia does not have the capacity to push further by itself on the ground. They don't have the manpower. They've lost over 100,000 soldiers. They can't move any further at this point. So even if whatever tanks arrive at Ukraine, like I said earlier, would not be of any use, except, of course, you are now thinking that Ukraine itself wants to start to fire missiles into Russia. And that won't happen. That would be an escalation of tremendous extent. So that won't happen. all of this in the mix, it's like two people fighting and then they run out of steam and then say, you have to separate and bring a truce to this fight. We simply don't have the capacity to move any further. And that is where we are. I mean, there have been assassinations of top Russian generals. Those have been going on. There have been Wagner is losing men. Wagner is about 159 that were held captives before now. So we are getting to the point where the war can not go any further because there are no resources to prosecute this war on either side. They don't have any resources to keep this war going on. There will be no reason for any tanks. Instead, the world should not lose sight of what China aims to do in Taiwan. That is the next phase of this war. As it is in Ukraine, is slowly coming to what you can call a stability in the face of war, but it's not going to. We are not going to record any new wins on either side.
Let me ask you about what you just said now, where you said world attention should now be focused on. We do know that the Chinese leader had asked his armed forces to prepare, giving them a 2027 target with relation to Taiwan. But all indications, perhaps, even though there has been no announcement in that regard, all indications perhaps would indicate maybe that time scale has been brought forward by a number of measures. There have been a lot of drills around Taiwan which have been said to be the result of provocations by various parties in the conflict, and any attempt by anyone interested in the conflict to try to broker some truce or say something about the methodology, the background, the history to the Taiwan-China conflict. China's response has been a firm no. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to discuss it. Don't bring it up. Even when the Brazilian president tried to make mention of it, these are people who traditionally would be considered to be friends of China. The Chinese are very firm and say, we don't want to discuss that. Bring up other issues, let's discuss trade, let's discuss other things, but we don't want to discuss that. Now, do you see a situation where, as you said, if all eyes turn to what China may or may not be thinking about doing in Taiwan at the moment, there is the possibility that while the Ukraine conflict, as you said, has this kind of lull or limbo in it, this may be the next theater of conflict?
There's no doubt about it. There's simply no doubt about it. Any country, any leader who has the best interest of its own people at heart will start to prepare for that. This was where it was definitely going to come to. What Russia did in Ukraine, that expedition that has caused untold losses and hardship, was essentially trying to bring out China. That was what Putin was doing all along. But Putin did not have the resources. Putin understood very well that he couldn't, by any measure, be able to assert authority over Ukraine. He simply was going to do it to say, I have done the first phase, now China take over. Okay, annexing Crimea and all of that, those were easy enough for Putin to do. But then the attention that Putin required was essentially from China. And you can see that immediately at the point when Putin could not move any further, the Russian president visited. And a whole lot of attention was paid to that visit. All right. Now, Putin prepared the platform for China to start to look at that template for invading Taiwan. However, there are some factors that will determine. I don't even think we will have to wait till 2027 before China invades Taiwan. I believe very much so that within the next 2 years, it will happen. To say that we wait till 2027 is to say that we want to be caught napping. And even Putin did not leave us as to any doubt regarding what he was planning to do in Ukraine since annexing Crimea. It's the same attention that we should be paying to China. Will it be done? Yes, there's nothing that will stop China because ultimately this war is between China and United States. All of these other countries are just mere pawns on the game of chess on the board, all right? So China would aim to invade Taiwan that enjoys overt support from United States. Japan will take sides with the United States. NATO will be an appendage of what the United States says. It will be China, it will be Russia on the other side. It will be North Korea joining them there. The question then will be, what will African leaders do at that point? Where will African leaders pitch their tent? So this is what will happen within the next 2 years. To wait till 2027 will be for us to be caught napping, and what are the potential repercussions that we may have. Another recession on the card, a global crisis of disruption of economies, of international economies. So the solution at this moment lies with what NATO decides to do and the results of the elections that will be held in the United States come 2024.
I'm happy you brought up the fact that, the African continent seems to be, sort of caught napping by many of these things when they happen. We're unprepared mostly. And then because the continent does not speak with one voice largely in the way that the EU does, and sometimes a number of other such economic and political groupings do, it's difficult to respond in a way that benefits the African continent. Already as it is now, the reports are that the Russian Wagner group that you mentioned is supplying the rapid support forces in Sudan with ammunition. Now, that is something that has not been confirmed, but the reports are that that's what is happening. Now, if you just take that as an example, the Russian forces, the Wagner group, is also said to be in Mali, is said to be in Burkina Faso, helping out with security and fighting jihadists. And, other countries, of course, China has a base, a naval base in Djibouti. And so it's going to be difficult for the continent to, speak with one voice to these people, the United States, as you said, and China. So when we say let's put our eye on it, what should those African countries who want to put their eye on this conflict with a view to drawing the necessary lessons, what should they be looking at? This question is not only one for research, but is one for reflection. You put it together, so very complicated, and the implications are truly scary. Those were the words I used with some of your correspondents yesterday. Now, this is where we are, and this is the purport of our local elections everywhere. The local elections in African countries must take a different turn. The local elections, the electioneering. At some point, we must be able to tell the market woman that what happens in America affects you one way or the other. And how do we establish that? Even the fact that we are losing the best of our minds to foreign nations in droves shows already that we are in some problem that we have not been able to determine the magnitude. Thankfully, I believe that the president-elect has an idea of what these issues are. And I suspect, even listening to him, that his attention is drawn more to improving Nigeria's economic powers on the international scene. So rather than advocate for climate change that would reduce and export the export quantity of our petroleum products, is instead saying, give me the funds to improve our standing economically using our God-given natural resources, which includes fossil fuels. However, it is time to start to strengthen our regional blocks. That is the only way Africa can start to speak. We've lost sight of ECOMOG that Nigeria used to lead. We have to strengthen ourselves from the regions, okay? West Africa brings some stability there. What is happening in Sudan is inimical to the development of Africa across the continent. Because if we are bogged down by our own regional wars, we will not be able to see what is coming. With regards to the support that we receive from China and a few other foreign countries, they are investing in Africa. But when we start to profile our own local solutions to our problems, they cannot take away those investments. I wait to see who China will sell Nigerian infrastructure to, who will buy. It's not as if God has given us the most resources of all, which is the talents that we have, which is the intellect that we have, proven worldwide. We have the capacity. The crisis we have is leadership. And even that is waning. The last elections in Nigeria already show
that young people and youths have an idea of the trajectory where we should be headed. And even nature abhors vacuum, all right? The old leaders in Africa, year in, year out, are getting closer to their end. And we have a young population that understands what needs to be done. So we need to start to strengthen our regional blocks. We need to improve our electioneering methods to bring up leaders that can engage on the international scene. And those who find themselves in office also require support by being told, advised on the decisions to make when it comes to international interest. So what should African countries be doing? I've said on the continent, we need to strengthen our regional blocks. But in each nation, we need to build institutions for transparent electioneering. And when we have leaders thrown up after elections, they require all the support to be able to understand where the world is headed so that we strengthen our economies. So we have to reduce export of raw materials. We need to begin to build economic and manufacturing hubs in each of our nations so that Africa is not the market. Africa becomes the destination. That is the responsibility of each country on the African continent at this time.
Indeed, a lot of food for thought there, a lot to chew for the leaders on the African continent. Yinka Oyeniji, as always, thank you for your perspective. One only hopes that those who are involved in this are listening and they take the correct decisions, even as we continue to monitor the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Aladi. God bless you.
And after the break, investigations reveal Russian mercenary group Wagner may have been supplying Sudan's rapid support forces with missiles to aid their fight against the country's army. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Moscow has installed new commanders at the head of its Baltic and Pacific fleets. According to the Russian news agency TASS, the former head of Russia's Baltic Fleet, Admiral Viktor Lina, is now in charge of the Pacific Fleet, and Vice Admiral Vladimir Vorobkov is the new commander of the fleet in the Baltics. Admiral Lina replaces the previous head of the Pacific Fleet, Sergei Avatiaks, whose surprise retirement was announced last week. News of Mr. Avatiaks' removal made waves, coming just a few days after the Pacific Fleet was ordered to participate in an unannounced major maneuver set to simulate Russian forces repelling a theoretical enemy landing. Officially, the 65-year-old Admiral Avatiaks was retired because he had reached retirement age, but independent media, on the other hand, have pointed to the high losses that parts of the fleet under his leadership are said to have suffered in the war in Ukraine. Europe's air traffic control authorities say it has been battling an ongoing attack claimed pro-Russian hackers since last week. According to the European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation, or Eurocontrol, there hasn't been any impact on flights, though access to its website has been affected. Eurocontrol is an intergovernmental organization that helps manage Europe's airspace and ensure the smooth operation of tens of thousands of flights every day by sharing information between commercial and military actors. The group has 41 member states, including countries outside the European Union, such as the United Kingdom and Israel, and is headquartered in Brussels. Sudanese and regional diplomatic sources say the Russian mercenary group Wagner has been supplying Sudan's rapid support forces with missiles to aid their fight against the country's army. The sources said the surface-to-air missiles have significantly buttressed the paramilitary fighters and their leader, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, as he battles for power with General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudan's military ruler and head of its armed forces. The powerful Russian mercenary group has played a public and pivotal role in Moscow's foreign military campaigns, namely in Ukraine, and has repeatedly been accused of committing atrocities in Africa, where it has helped to prop up Moscow's growing influence and season of resources. General Dagalo and Burhan had been jockeying for power in negotiations over restoring civilian leadership in Sudan before talks broke down, erupting into some of the worst violence the country has seen in decades. The fighting has claimed hundreds of lives and deprived millions of people of electricity, water, and food. Nikolai Peskov, the son of Kremlin spokesman Dimitri Peskovs, says that he has decided to serve in Ukraine with Russia's Wagner mercenary force. Speaking in an interview, he said, quote, "I considered it my duty. I couldn't sit on the sidelines and watch friends and other people go there. When I went there, I had to change my last name. Nobody really knew who I was." He added that he served for nearly 6 months and received the Medal for Courage. Children of government figures and Russia's elite have received criticism in the past for failing to fight in Ukraine. Nikolai Peskov's interview comes after the Wagner chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, said that the Kremlin spokesperson's son had served as a gunner with his group. Let's talk to retired U.S. Army captain, national defense and military strategist, who joins us from our Abuja studios, Captain Bish Johnson. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me.
Let me begin from closer home before we go to Ukraine and Russia itself. Are you perhaps surprised that this report's coming out that Russia is also active in Sudan, at least acting through its proxy, the Wagner group, supplying the RSF forces with ammunition in the fight against the Sudanese army? One would have expected that might have been something that isn't really possible, but given what we now know about war, anything is possible.
I am not in any way surprised that we have superpowers involved in the conflict in Sudan. If you go back in history, that has always been the case. Africa has always been a battleground for proxy warfare between the superpowers. So even if you trace it all the way to the Soviet era, that has always been the case. So I am not in any way surprised at all that this Russian private security organization, the Wagner Group, is somehow aiding in the war in Sudan. You have to understand the reason why the Sudanese this conflict in Sudan is raging now is a contest for power and who controls the resources in Sudan. And so the Wagner Group will have an interest in partaking in that war so that at the end of the day, if the side they support triumphs, they'll be able to have a say in how those resources are controlled. That has always been the case with Africa, where you have foreign countries getting involved in making decisions on how resources are utilized, resources in Africa are utilized.
Mr. Yinka Oyeniji, my guest earlier on in the program, said that, look, what is happening in Ukraine is simply a dress rehearsal for what is expected to happen between China and Taiwan, in the sense that, what Russia had done was to show that it can be done, and that the Chinese have now been drawn out, particularly with relations to Taiwan, even though, the allegations are there that they are also helping the Russians, even in Ukraine. Do you buy this, given, from the vantage point of being a strategist? Is this really viable that what Russia did in going into Ukraine was to draw out the Chinese to show them that, this could also be done in Taiwan?
I wouldn't exactly, agree that is the reason behind the actions that the Russians are taking in Ukraine. At the same time, I can't dismiss it. Look, the Russians this has always been their objective, to bring back Ukraine as part of the Russian Federation. In 2014, you saw what they did in Crimea. And so I do not exactly believe that the reason why they are doing that, causing this enormous amount of destruction, both to themselves and the Ukrainians, is to show the Chinese that it can be done. It has always been their stated objective to be able to recover, some of the old Soviet, countries and bring them back to their, homeland, according to them. So, the Chinese may be watching what is happening in Ukraine and, learning some lessons from that. But the primary objective is not for them to demonstrate to the Chinese that it can be done.
Let's look at the conflict from an overview angle now. You were a U.S. Army captain, and the United States is known, or at least has been known, to have the world's strongest air power. The U.S. Air Force had always been the most feared branch of the United States Armed Forces, and they haven't played any role as at yet in the conflict in Ukraine. And one is wondering if, as some people think, that this war will probably be settled in the air, because on the ground, what is happening is a lot of destruction, but nobody is getting a decisive victory. The Russians are not getting a decisive victory. The Ukrainians are not getting a decisive victory. And giving anybody tanks or any of the other fighting vehicles and so on will make no difference. That it is about air power, and that all recent wars around the world have been won by air power. Do you buy that? And do you think the U.S. is going to use its air power eventually, to sort out this matter in Ukraine?
Well, first and foremost, the U.S. has no intention in getting involved in terms of having boots on the ground in this war between the Ukrainians and the Russians, because that will lead to, massive escalation of the conflict. Now, whether the war is going to be settled in the air or ground, I don't think most wars have not been won through area bombardment. What you do with area bombardment is to degrade, the powers of the opposition. At the end of the day, you're still going to have ground troops. The foot soldiers go in there from door to door and clean out the mess. Yeah, area bombardment, will help you to degrade your opponents, but the ground troops must have to go in there and do door-to-door, clearing. Now, as far as area bombardment, look, as the Russians are shooting all these missiles and artillery that they are shooting every day, they are depleting their stockpile. And I can tell you that, they have probably done more than they can ever do again. Considering the amount of sanction that has been placed on them and their inability to be able to replenish, the stockpile of what they have already exhausted. So I don't see them, doing more than what they have done. Look, let me tell you something. This war, there are three parties to this war. And those parties are the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the West. Of all those three parties, only one party has a clearly stated objective, and that is the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians want total restoration of all of their territories, including Crimea. And the way you win in battle is to have a clear objective of what you want to achieve. Because when you have that end goal, that clear objective, it allows you to set up a strategy to be able to achieve that objective. The Russians, their objective is not clear. At first, they wanted to decapitate the Ukrainian government by going into Kyiv, killing the president and installing a puppet government. When that didn't work, they put back to eastern Ukraine to be able to establish their footprint there, maybe carve out that part of the country, and that seemed not to be working for them either. So their objective is not clear. And because they don't have a clear objective of what they want to achieve, they're not going to have a clear strategy. Now, for the West, I don't know what the West, their end goal is. I don't know if the end goal is for the Ukrainians to win, which they have said that they want the Ukrainians to win. Now, if they want the Ukrainians to win, they have to come up with a clear strategy on how the Ukrainians are going to win. And the only way the Ukrainians are going to win is if the West is ready to give them everything they are asking to be able to carry out this war, to a successful conclusion without the West having, boots on the ground. But so far, that seems not to be the case, because they are only giving them enough weapons to be able to fend off the Russians, but they are not giving them enough to be able to go in offensive, serious offensive. I've heard people say the Ukrainians are planning offensive. There is no offensive when you are fighting in your own country. All of the destruction that is being done now is being done in Ukraine. Until the Ukrainians are able to have enough weapon with long-range missiles that will be able to hit Russian territory and put the Russians on the back foot, this war will remain, a war of attrition. Nobody's going forward and nobody's going backward, and it will just be there.
Let's look at when you talk about having objective and goals. And you mentioned the fact that there are three parties. There's the Russians, there's the Ukrainians, and then you have what you described as the West. Now, allow me to substitute the West for NATO in my next question, and to say that it does appear as if the objective is to encircle Russia. NATO wants to encircle Russia and to contain it. In that way, in terms of defense strategy, there will be no way for the Russians to break out and cause any more havoc or mischief if they are completely surrounded by NATO, because they know that if they attack any particular NATO country, that means they're going to be facing a war with 30 or more countries at the same time, in which the view is that they cannot prevail. Does this make sense?
Yeah, sure. To some extent, it does make sense. If that is their objective, is to encircle Russia, I think they have achieved that already, with Finland already joining NATO, and then you have Sweden, almost joining NATO. That objective has been achieved. Now, in Ukraine, that's where I don't know exactly what their objective there is, because if they don't give them what they need to be able to win this war, it will remain a war of attrition. And so far, I don't see the willingness of, NATO countries to be able to provide the long-range missiles that the Ukrainians have been asking for, even with the, air capabilities that they have also been requesting, until they're able to provide them with those, capabilities. The Ukrainians will always be on the defensive because they are fighting this war in their own territory. They're not fighting it in Russia. For them to be able to put Russia on the back foot, they should be able to strike, within the territory of Russia. But if that happens, that may lead to, a massive escalation.
But Captain Johnson, you better than me know that many of the things that the Ukrainians are asking for, apart from, looking at it, that they could eventually make the Ukrainians become a threat to the people who are supplying them these weapons. These things are also very expensive to get. If you're asking for F-16 fighter jets, the last time I checked for the price of an F-16 fighter jet, you were talking of 40, 45, 50 million dollars, and you're asking for several of these kind of things. You're asking for Abrams tanks, whose prices are also in the millions and multiples of millions of dollars. So again, apart from the willingness to supply, isn't there an economic side to this and then a defense strategy side? Because if I give someone who is my friend today a weapon, I don't know to which use he or she will put it after today. And I won't be able to get that weapon back, once I've handed it over.
I didn't hear the last part.
The last point was that if I give my friend a weapon today because he's my friend today, tomorrow if he becomes my enemy, how do I get that weapon back?
Well, obviously, you're not going to get it back. That's why you have to choose who is your friend and who to help. You see, my thing is that NATO and the West have already made a decision to help the Ukrainians. Is either you're in or you're not. Since you're already in, you should go all the way out in assisting these people if your stated objective is for them to succeed in this war. If you can't do half, doing half is too dangerous. You have to go all the way in. I understand. Wars are expensive. That's why we should not even start war in the first place. It's because it's expensive. You have to have that economic might, to be able to have, that military might. So it costs money. Sometimes, it costs power, because there is no war that gets won without the support of, your citizens. At some point, the citizens will get tired and then they will withdraw their support. So that is why before we make any decision to go into any kind of war, we have to think so hard about getting into it, because it will cost a lot, both in terms of blood and in terms of treasure. So it's not a decision you just make haphazardly or on the fly and, start up a war. It's costing both sides. Even the Russians are not finding it easy. It has depleted their stockpile of weapons. Russia, as it stands right now, cannot fight any major military as we speak, because they have already weakened themselves by going into this Ukrainian war.
Indeed. Retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist, Bish Johnson, thank you as always for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
And when we return, ballets and opera dancers at Russia's Bolshoi Theater look to China for new ties. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Welcome back. Russia is threatening to terminate the Black Sea grain deal, viewed as critical for solving a world hunger crisis if a group of 7 nations, the G7, ban exports to the country. Such a ban could be part of the ever-evolving set of sanctions the Allies have leveled against Moscow for its war in Ukraine. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, implied in a Telegram post that Russia would answer a new export ban by halting the flow of goods that are the most sensitive for the G7. Mr. Medvedev wrote, in this case, the grain deal will end for them as well as many other things that they need. The G7 called for the extension, full implementation and expansion of the Black Sea grain deal in a statement published by the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of Japan. G7 ministers said in the statement that they will continue to design restrictive measures against Russia to shield the population in need from unintended consequences by ensuring food and fertilizers are carved out. Let's talk now to Ini John McQuarrie of our business desk. Morning, Ini.
Good morning.
Well, Russia is threatening to terminate the grain deal.
Yeah.
That has its own implications further afield than even the G7 and...
Obviously, because we do remember the days before the grain deal, and we know what we saw with grains, corn, wheat all over the world, because these two are the giants when it comes to global grain. So these threats, of course, it should concern everybody, including Nigeria, every country, not just the G7 or the EU or Ukraine.
Or the Russians, for that matter.
Or the Russians, for that matter. Because, of course, Russians, they have their own condition. And we know just over the weekend, the G7 are talking about total ban.
That's it. And this was in response to that.
Yes,
if you do that...
And remember, even before this threat of total ban, Russia had said that even though there was no restriction on the supply of their food and fertilizer, the issue of logistics and moving their things around, insurance company, shipping, has already restricted them from doing businesses. A lot of companies who are supposed to be involved in that line of business, dealing with fertilizer and food from Russia, are having hiccups. They cannot do it. So they were already asking for that as a condition. And now we have G7 talking about extending the ban. Well,
talk about being tone deaf. Now, the EU is working to find a balance between supporting Ukraine and mitigating the negative impact of this grain.
Same grain again.
Yeah, it's like everybody is now saying, look, let's deal for ourselves, you know, and so on.
You can't love your neighbor more than you love yourself. That's actually the fact. I mean, even if you're a Christian, the Bible says, love your neighbor as you love yourself.
And that's at the very minimum.
And that's
at the very minimum.
Exactly. You know, so, I mean, we've been talking about how the farmers in the EU countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, they're having issues because of the cheap grain that's coming from Ukraine into their country. So I think they're having a meeting even today as we speak.
Absolutely.
They started yesterday talking about some of the ways. Should they reintroduce those import tax that has made Ukraine wheat or Ukraine corn, that's a grain generally, that's made it cheaper than, you know, domestically produced grain.
Yeah, because they pass through and they don't go through any of these taxes or tariffs, which is what makes them cheaper, actually.
That's what makes them cheaper, yeah. So right now, I think they do have ban. They're talking of expanding the ban, talking of another ban. So
many bans.
Products like sunflower, rapeseed will be banned from entering these countries. But remember we talked about last week, they can pass through this country to other countries. They created
a corridor
which
they can pass through.
That will be strictly followed if it has to work. So we'll see what comes out at the end of their meetings, if they have an agreement, because, you know, a country like Hungary is very loud.
It's not in agreement with everybody.
They do have compensation for them. I think 5 million euro for Slovakia, 3 million. But I mean, they're saying how much? How
much is that
compared
to what?
To the farmers who are making their living from agricultural produce.
Absolutely. Very interesting, very complicated.
Very complicated.
And, national interests at stake. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
And finally on the program, much like the Russian government, the Bolshoi Theatre, home to two of the world's greatest opera and ballet companies, is being shunned by the West over Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine and looking east to China instead. The Bolshoi's director, Vladimir Yurin, told a news conference in Moscow to announce its 2023-2024 program that he was saddened by the loss of what had been regular creative cooperation with Western theater companies and artists. The Bolshoi Ballet is already set to go to China in July, and Mr. Yurin said detailed discussions were underway about both the ballet and the opera going in 2024. But he said the reasons for touring were not financial and that it was a myth that overseas tours brought in significant revenue. The Bolshoi Orchestra is due to collaborate with Moscow's Mali Theatre for the first time this year for a production of Alexander Ostrovsky's play The Snow Maiden with incidental music by Tchaikovsky to mark 150 years since it was first performed. The ballet will also travel to the Belarusian capital Minsk in November and then on to Oman in January. And it's on that musical note that we end our program this Monday. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akeredoluale. Do have a pleasant part of what is left of the Salah holidays. Good morning.